All right, all right, all right. We're back. We're back with another video, and this one is fun. How do you know where to insert backstory or flashbacks? This is kind of one of those questions, those things that haunt readers. Like, should I use backstory? Does this need some flashback? I get this all the time, and this is definitely a valid question. And I know I've done videos on backstory and flashbacks and maybe what the difference is between them and how to implement them in your story, but I don't know if we spent a lot of time on talking about the location of them. Here is a method that I've used in my developmental work and my book building work to help my clients identify where pieces of their backstory or their flashbacks, essentially just your history that's not on your timeline, where to insert those pieces. Whether it's a backstory or flashback is kind of irrelevant to this discussion because we're going to treat them as the same type of thing. They are just bits of your story, bits of your history, bits of your life that do not fall on your timeline. So to give us a frame, we're going to talk about, we're going to use, for an example, the story of surviving after divorce, okay? And let's say you've identified your time frame. The beginning is when I met the guy, and the end is when I moved to my first apartment as a single woman, okay? That's my timeline. Maybe this is like a 10-year gap, who knows? But that is the timeline. Backstory or flashback is going to be something that exists outside of that timeline. It's not typically in the future after the ending. Sometimes it can be, and that's more of like a epilogue type of situation, but it's typically what exists before the beginning of your timeline. So this is going to be, in our example, a content that exists before I meet the guy. Okay, so this is what I have my clients do and what you can try to do as well. You want to start out by laying out all of your major scenes in chronological order. You just want to lay them out in a straight line. You want to forget about any type of structure, like where your book actually starts, any loop-de-loops that you're doing in your sequence. You just want to lay them out in chronological order. Then I want you to sort of, in your head, or write out or vocalize, or however it works best for you, you want to just kind of walk through your story. It's almost like, what if we were sitting down at a coffee shop and I go, okay, Sally, tell me about your story. It starts when you meet this guy, and then what happens? And you go, oh yeah, I met him and we like fall in love and we date and we this and we that. And you kind of take yourself through this story, maybe more on the surface, right? Or you can get more detailed, that's fine. But at every new scene, I want you to stop and ask yourself, what does the reader need to know in order to understand the depth and emotional impact of that scene? They could need some backstory or maybe a bit of history on like the action in that scene, and that's okay. If you're like, oh yeah, I'm describing moving into this house, and this was a special house that you had picked out when you were 15, and all of a sudden, like magically, this is the house that's for sale. Well, we're going to probably want to know about that history, about you, off your timeline, dreaming up this house and designing it in your head, and this is all of a sudden your dream house. That is maybe not emotionally deep, but it gives meaning to that current scene. The real question is, what meaning or value does your backstory or flashback give to the current scene? If it's sort of just like, oh yeah, I met this guy, but you probably should know who I am, and well, I was born on this day, and these are my parents and my family and this and that, and like if you're just giving us your biographical history, that is not valuable to the scene of meeting the guy, right? So I hope you're following along here and kind of getting how you weigh out whether or not this needs backstory to give it depth and meaning, and whether or not the backstory actually does give it some value. So let me give you an example on the divorce example that we're talking about, the divorce timeline. So in my story, I'm starting out when I meet the guy. And, you meet the guy, you date for a while, he proposes, you plan the wedding, and then you are at the wedding, right? I may walk through there and I may not insert a ton of backstories, and there's probably some about who I am and, how we met and all of that, right? But when we get to the wedding, I might, during the time I'm walking down the aisle, I might flash back to the moment that I can see in my head as a little girl walking down the road back to my house, playing from a friend's house. We must have talked about something, or there must have been something on TV. I don't know. Somehow my mind is on marriage. And it was in that moment I can remember vividly thinking, I'm never going to get married. I was like dead set. Like, this was not a, ew, boys are gross. Like, they have cooties. I don't want anything to do with them. I just knew I never wanted to get married. Wouldn't that be kind of a interesting place to flash back? Like, while I'm walking down the aisle, I flash back to a place I'm walking down the street, and all of a sudden I think I'm flashing back to that moment where I had decided I would never get married, but here I am walking down the aisle towards my future husband. Might that give you a little glimpse as to what's in the future? The divorce, which of course you already know if you're in the story and you're reading about the divorce, or that's in the theme. That's on the back cover. That's not a mystery, but it's just a little foreshadowing almost. Like, this is where we're headed. This is an element of my history, a piece of my history that gives weight and value to the theme of my story. It gives an interesting little twist. I could just tell you, like, I never thought I would get married, and here I find myself walking down the aisle. Well, what does that mean? I never thought I would get married. I could show you. I could bring you back to this moment in my history where I vividly remember making this decision. So it's sort of one of those, you need to take it scene by scene. Is there something in my scene, in this current scene, that connects to my past in a way that enhances my story with value and with deeper meaning, deeper emotional connection with the readers? So this could be something you do on paper with markers. You could get really visual with it. You could have it in a Word document or some other word processing style document or on a notebook, and you write out each scene and you kind of just talk about the scenes. You just talk about them, and you just want to feel into, what else could I have here? What else applies here? What does the reader know to understand what's going on here, to really understand what's going on here? So here's a good example of something that might not work. Let's say in this divorce story, I'm telling you about how I met this guy, and I'm telling you about how we started our family. And then randomly I kind of flash back, or I give you this tidbit of history about how my uncle got divorced. Well, why is that relevant, right? Why, you want to ask yourself, well, why is my uncle's divorce or my dad's divorce or whoever it is relevant to my current story? Why is that detail needed? What value does it bring to your current timeline? There may be value there, but if you're not making the connection, no one's going to know it but you. So maybe my uncle or my dad was divorced, and at that moment when I learned about the divorce, I had this sort of premonition or like future vision of me going through that process. And maybe that is another bit of foreshadowing or something to that effect. You're going to see my internal thinking on this matter, how I've learned to perceive divorce. Maybe it was just normalized. Maybe I was the only married person in my entire family, and every single other marriage in my entire family was already divorced. So my family's history all of a sudden becomes relevant because it's connecting you, the reader, to my internal thought process and my internal belief system, how I've looked at this during my life, that's important to the story's depth. So if I just tell you like, yeah, I got divorced and then, this and that in the end, right? That's not a very exciting story. It's a story we've all heard. It goes like this. Hey, my friend just got divorced, right? It's a story we've all heard. So you need to make sure that there's enough depth in there that the reader is understanding you as the main character. They're understanding how you think. They're understanding how you feel. You're sharing all of this. You're sharing the connections. You're sharing like, this is the stuff in my history that has made me who I am today, which is why I'm reacting the way I'm reacting, or which is why I've decided to do these things. It's why I'm behaving this way, etc. So you are in charge of determining the relevancy and the connection that this backstory, this history is going to bring to your current timeline. The best way to discover whether or not you're using backstory or flashbacks appropriately, or whether or not you're overdoing it or underdoing it, is to get a developmental editor. That's really one of the main things when I'm doing a developmental edit that I look at. What's the relevancy of this piece of history? What's missing here? This feels like kind of a big deal. I just did a developmental edit the other day where she made this statement like, yeah, my dad never thought I would amount to anything. So when I told him I started my own business, he was surprised. That's pretty classic for my dad. And I'm like, why is that classic? What's the deal here? What am I missing? I don't know this guy. I don't know him. She knows him. She knows why it's classic, but she's not telling me why it's classic. Whether or not that's relevant, I can't judge because I don't know it. But my job as the editor is to point out what's missing on the page. So I'm going to be looking, and other developmental editors will too, but we look for where is that past connection that might make this feel more impactful, because clearly you put it in your story for some reason. So that's an example of like not including something that we need. An example of including something that we don't need is in that same edit, in that same manuscript, she is talking about how she is this woman with no funding, kind of middle class childhood, has no financial, support. And all of a sudden she has this brilliant idea for this business, and she is climbing this mountain of, like, you're only going to be successful if you're this white dude from an Ivy League school. And here she is, this girl who barely, she has a 2-year degree and comes from a middle class Midwestern suburb, right? So she is like, the odds are stacked against her. But why does her story have include a glimpse of this like kind of bad relationship she had in college? What's the relevancy there? If I just told you the premise of the book and shared kind of a basic, like, she's telling us about this bad experience she had with a boyfriend, they don't match, right? They don't match on the surface. Unless there's something deeper that's connecting them under the surface, they don't match and they don't belong together. So we're not going to ditch the premise of the book. We're going to ditch the backstory. We're going to say, like, this doesn't belong here, unless you can help connect it to the timeline. Like, are you struggling with some particular, like, investor guy because he looks like your ex or something? Like, did you have a moment of panic because, like, you took yourself back? You flashbacked in real life. You flashed back in real life to that scary, traumatic moment with this ex-boyfriend, and it shocked you. Maybe that is relevant, but that connection wasn't on the page. So as the editor, I point that out. Where is the connection here? I'm not seeing it. If there is one, you need to make it. If not, this needs to be cut. So that's the long way around the bush of how to know where you use backstory and flashbacks. You need to understand kind of the idea behind their value, but laying your story out on a timeline, a visual, just chronologically based timeline, a straight line, will help you just walk through the story and go, okay, what's relevant about my history here? And you can just start making notes. You can just start listing things. just, you don't have to judge them yet, okay? Just start listing them and then go back and go like, okay, let's start assessing. And what I brought up about the value it brings to your current timeline and the meaning and the depth and, emotional depth and making that connection. Those are the pieces you use to judge whether or not that flashback or that piece of backstory should be included. When in doubt, write it out. Okay, that's the rule. When in doubt, write it out. Especially if you're already planning on hiring an editor, the more they see, the more feedback they can give you. We don't know what's not on the page. All we know is sometimes it feels like you're not saying something. We could be wrong, but we don't know because we're not you. We don't know your story, and that's okay. You want someone who doesn't know you or doesn't know your story to give you this feedback. Your friends and family do not make good developmental editors because they know your backstory and they're going, oh yeah, that makes sense because of that thing she did like 10 years ago. If that's not on your manuscript, that's not relevant. They just made that connection because they already knew. Okay? So lay it out visually, get an idea, just start brainstorming, and then go back and make the judgment call. And again, when in doubt, write it out and get it to an editor, get it to a beta reader, get it to something that can give you kind of a neutral, unbiased, non-family member perspective on that if you are truly struggling to see the value or connection. But above all, trust your instinct. You know whether or not it's relevant. It's just very hard sometimes to see how a couple trees from the forest really only belong in your story rather than all of them, the forest of your life, right? Our whole lives feel connected because they are. They're connected just to us only, not to this story that you are sharing with the world. So I will end there. Please let me know what other questions you have on this topic. This is one of those trickier ones. It's tricky to give you more general insights, but I hope this is helpful. And tune in for my next video, of course. I will see you there, right?